Hey there. Tonight, we're tracing something familiar back through the fog of centuries. Not the jolly figure you see in every shopping mall each December, but the winding path that led us there. You won't find magic here or flying reindeer leaping across your imagination in perfect formation. Just the slow accumulation of stories, the way myths build themselves brick by brick across generations, and the strange alchemy that transforms a Mediterranean bishop into a global icon dressed in red and white. If these wandering tales through history help you drift into sleep, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly settle your mind. And if you'd like to help this channel continue exploring the forgotten corners of the past, your support means more than you know. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and if you're still awake by the end, let me know. It's strangely comforting to know who else is following these threads through the dark hours of the night. So, settle in. Let the glow of your screen be the only light. And let's begin with a question that's simpler to ask than to answer. Where did Santa Claus come from? The story, like all good stories, begins with a real person. Not in the frozen north, not in some workshop surrounded by pointed-eared helpers, but in the warm Mediterranean sun of what is now southern Turkey. The year is around 270, though dates from this period are more suggestions than certainties. The Roman Empire sprawls across the known world, vast and complex, and already showing the hairline cracks that will, centuries later, split it apart. Christianity is young, dangerous, illegal in most places. To be a Christian in this world is to risk everything. And yet, people believe. They gather in secret. They share their faith in whispers. And into this world, in the city of Patara, a boy is born. His name is Nicholas. The details of his childhood are lost to time, buried under centuries of legend and pious embellishment. What we think we know comes from accounts written hundreds of years after his death, stories passed down through generations, each retelling adding a little polish, a little shine, until the man becomes indistinguishable from the myth. But certain themes persist across all the tellings, and in those persistent themes we might find something close to truth. Nicholas was born, the stories agree, to a wealthy family. His parents were Christians, devout and generous, and they raised their son in the faith, despite the danger. Some accounts name his parents Epiphanius and Johanna. Others call them Theophans and Nana. The names shift depending on who's telling the story and when. But what doesn't shift is this. They died when Nicholas was young, possibly in an epidemic that swept through the region. Plague was common in the ancient world, arriving without warning, departing without explanation. It left Nicholas orphaned, alone, and suddenly in possession of considerable wealth. He might have done what most young men in his position would do, lived comfortably, married well, managed his estates, faded into the comfortable obscurity of the provincial wealthy. But Nicholas, according to every account, took a different path. He gave it away. Not recklessly, not in some grand gesture designed to win praise, but quietly, methodically, to those who needed it most. There's a story that appears in almost every telling of his life, a story that will echo through the centuries and eventually help create the gift-giving figure we know today. It goes like this. In Nicholas's city, there lived a man who had once been wealthy but had fallen on desperately hard times. He had 3 daughters, and in the brutal mathematics of the ancient world, daughters without dowries were daughters without futures. They couldn't marry. They couldn't support themselves. The only path available to them, the only way they could survive, was prostitution. The father was in despair. Nicholas, hearing of this, decided to help. But being modest, perhaps even a bit shy, he didn't want to be known as the benefactor. So late one night, he crept to the man's house and tossed a bag of gold through the window. It was enough for the eldest daughter's dowry. She could marry. She could have a life. The father was baffled, grateful, amazed. He stayed up the next night, hoping to catch whoever had performed this miracle. But Nicholas was clever. He waited. On the 3rd night, he came again and tossed another bag of gold, this time for the 2nd daughter. But the father, determined, had stayed awake for many nights now, and this time he was ready. He rushed outside and caught Nicholas before he could disappear into the darkness. Nicholas made him promise not to tell anyone, though, of course, the story spread anyway. Good news always does. And in some versions of the tale, that 3rd bag of gold didn't go through the window at all. It went down the chimney and landed in a stocking that had been hung by the fire to dry. You can see it already, can't you? The threads that will weave themselves centuries later into Santa Claus. The secret gift-giving, the nighttime visits, the chimney, even the stockings. None of these details were invented by Madison Avenue or Coca-Cola. They were there from the beginning, embedded in the legend of a Mediterranean bishop born 1700 years ago. Nicholas eventually became a priest, trained by his uncle, who was the bishop of Patara. And when the bishop of the nearby city of Myra died, a larger and more important city in the region of Lycia, Nicholas found himself chosen to fill the role. The accounts of how this happened vary wildly. Some say the other bishops gathered to choose a successor and were told in a vision that the first man named Nicholas to enter the church should be appointed. Nicholas, unaware of any of this, simply came to pray and found himself made a bishop. Other versions are less dramatic but amount to the same thing. He was chosen, he accepted, and he became the Bishop of Myra, a position he would hold for the rest of his life. This was during the reign of Diocletian, the Roman emperor who launched one of the most severe persecutions of Christians in the empire's history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned. Christians were arrested, tortured, sometimes executed. Nicholas, as a prominent bishop, would have been an obvious target. And indeed, most sources agree that he was imprisoned during this persecution. What happened to him in prison is unclear. He may have been tortured. He certainly would have suffered. But he survived. And when Constantine came to power and ended the persecution, Nicholas was released along with countless other Christians who had been languishing in Roman prisons. He returned to Myra, resumed his duties as bishop, and continued his quiet work of helping those in need. There's another famous story from this period, though it's less reliably documented. Some accounts say that Nicholas attended the Council of Nicaea in 325, the great gathering of bishops called by Constantine to settle disputes about Christian doctrine. The council was debating the nature of Christ, specifically whether he was divine or merely an exceptional human being. A priest named Arius argued that Christ was created by God and therefore subordinate to him. Nicholas, if he was there, would have been firmly on the other side of this debate. Some versions of the story get even more dramatic. They say Nicholas was so enraged by Arius's arguments that he walked across the room and slapped him in the face. For this breach of decorum, Nicholas was stripped of his bishop's insignia and briefly imprisoned. But then, the story goes, Christ and the Virgin Mary appeared to him in his cell and restored his symbols of office. It's a great story. It shows Nicholas as passionate, uncompromising, willing to fight for what he believed. But there's a problem. No contemporary account of the Council of Nicaea mentions Nicholas. No list of attendees includes his name. The slapping story doesn't appear in any text until centuries after the council took place. It might be true, or it might be a legend that grew up around a man whose reputation for defending the faith made such a story seem plausible. We'll never know for certain. What we do know, or what we can reasonably infer, is that Nicholas died on December 6th, probably in the year 343. He was buried in his cathedral in Myra. And then something interesting happened. His reputation grew. Stories about him spread. Miracles were attributed to him, both during his life and after his death. Sailors caught in storms prayed to Nicholas and survived. Children facing danger called on him and were saved. The sick were healed. The desperate were helped. Within a few generations, Nicholas had gone from being a respected bishop to being one of the most venerated saints in both the Eastern and Western Christian churches. Churches were built in his honor. His feast day, December 6th, became a major celebration. His relics, actual pieces of his body, were believed to work miracles. Pilgrims traveled to Myra to visit his tomb. And from there, his legend began to spread across Europe. It spread slowly at first, the way all things spread in the medieval world, carried by travelers, by monks, by merchants. Each culture that encountered Nicholas adapted him slightly, emphasizing different aspects of his legend, adding local color, blending him with existing traditions. In some places, he remained primarily a figure of religious devotion, a saint to be venerated and prayed to. In others, he became something more folkloric, a figure who walked the line between the sacred and the secular, between church and celebration. In the year 1087, something happened that would dramatically increase Nicholas's fame throughout Europe. Italian merchants from the city of Bari, motivated by devotion or by the potential for profit, or possibly both, sailed to Myra and stole Nicholas's remains. Myra had recently been conquered by Muslim forces, and the merchants justified their theft by claiming they were rescuing the saint's body from the infidels. They brought Nicholas's bones back to Bari, where a magnificent basilica was built to house them, and Bari became a major pilgrimage site, drawing Christians from across Europe who wanted to venerate the relics of Saint Nicholas. This theft, or rescue, or act of pious larceny, whatever you want to call it, had an enormous effect on Nicholas's cult. Suddenly, he wasn't just an Eastern saint associated with the Orthodox Church and the Greek-speaking world. He was a Western saint, too, claimed by the Latin Church, celebrated in Italy and beyond. His feast day was observed with increasing enthusiasm. Churches were dedicated to him. Guilds adopted him as their patron. He became the patron saint of children, of sailors, of merchants, of pawnbrokers, of numerous cities and countries. In Russia, he became one of the most important saints, second only to the Virgin Mary. In Greece, he was equally revered. Across Europe, Nicholas's reputation grew and grew until he was one of the most recognizable and beloved figures in medieval Christianity. But something else was happening too. As Nicholas's cult spread across Europe, it began to absorb and blend with older, pre-Christian traditions. This is what Christianity had always done. It didn't simply erase the beliefs it encountered, it adapted them, Christianized them, gave them new names and new meanings. And in Northern Europe, in lands where Christianity arrived relatively late and where the old pagan beliefs still had deep roots, Nicholas began to merge with figures from those older traditions. In Germanic and Norse mythology, there were stories of Odin, the wandering god, who rode through the winter sky on an 8-legged horse. Odin was associated with winter, with the solstice, with gift-giving, and with punishment. He rewarded the worthy and cursed the wicked. During the Yule season, it was said that Odin led a great hunt across the sky, accompanied by spirits and ghosts. Children would leave out boots filled with straw and carrots for Odin's horse, and Odin would reward them with gifts. Sound familiar? The parallel isn't exact, but the echoes are there. A figure associated with winter, traveling through the sky, bringing gifts, judging behavior. These themes were already present in Northern European folklore when Christianity arrived. And when the Church introduced Saint Nicholas, these older themes attached themselves to him. The result was a figure who was neither purely Christian nor purely pagan, but something in between. A saint who rode through the winter sky. A holy man who brought gifts to children. A figure of both devotion and celebration. By the medieval period, the feast of Saint Nicholas on December 6th had become one of the most widely celebrated days of the year in much of Europe. It was a day of gift-giving, especially to children. It was a day of feasting and merriment. And it had developed its own customs and traditions that varied from place to place. In many regions, someone would dress up as Saint Nicholas, complete with bishop's robes and mitre, and go from house to house asking children if they had been good. Good children received gifts. Bad children received warnings, or sometimes something more tangible, like a stick or a lump of coal. Often, Saint Nicholas was accompanied by a dark, sometimes frightening companion, a servant or assistant who carried the punishment while Nicholas dispensed rewards. These companions had different names in different places. Krampus in Austria, Knecht Ruprecht in Germany, Zwarte Piet in the Netherlands. But the pattern was the same: a good figure and a bad figure, reward and punishment, light and dark. The message was clear: behave, be good. Saint Nicholas is watching. And if you're good, you'll be rewarded. If you're not, well, you'll face the consequences. In the Netherlands, Saint Nicholas became known as Sinterklaas. The Dutch celebrated his feast day with particular enthusiasm. Sinterklaas, in the Dutch tradition, was portrayed as a dignified elderly bishop with a white beard, wearing red bishop's robes and a tall mitre. He carried a golden staff, and he rode a white horse named a merry-go. According to the legend that developed, Sinterklaas lived in Spain and traveled to the Netherlands by steamship each year in mid-November, arriving in time to prepare for his feast day on December 6th. Why Spain? The connection seems to have emerged because Nicholas's relics were in Bari, Italy, which was associated with the Mediterranean South. Over time, this became Spain in the Dutch imagination. It's not historically accurate, but folklore rarely is. What matters is that it felt right, and so it became part of the story. On the evening of December 5th, Dutch children would leave out their shoes, often with carrots or hay for Sinterklaas's horse. In the morning, if they had been good, they would find small gifts, candy, or coins in their shoes. Sinterklaas brought presents. He rewarded good behavior. And he was accompanied by helpers, originally portrayed as Moorish servants, who carried the gifts and sometimes the switches for naughty children. The Sinterklaas tradition was deeply embedded in Dutch culture by the 1600s, which is important because that's when the Dutch began establishing colonies in the New World. In 1626, Dutch colonists established a settlement on the island of Manhattan, which they called New Amsterdam. It was a trading post, part of a larger Dutch colony called New Netherland that stretched along the Hudson River Valley. The colonists brought their language, their customs, their architecture, and their celebrations, including Sinterklaas. For several decades, New Amsterdam was a Dutch city, speaking Dutch, observing Dutch holidays. But in 1664, the English captured the colony and renamed it New York. The Dutch influence didn't disappear overnight. Dutch families remained. Dutch words entered the English language. Dutch buildings stood for generations. And Dutch celebrations, including Sinterklaas, persisted in some form, though they began to change, to adapt, to merge with English traditions. The historical record from this period is frustratingly sparse. Some scholars have searched for references to Sinterklaas celebrations in colonial New York and found very little. Others argue that the tradition continued in Dutch communities but went unrecorded, passed down within families rather than documented in official sources. What we can say with certainty is this. By the late 1700s, there was an awareness of St. Nicholas celebrations in New York, and there was a desire among some New Yorkers to revive or reinvent those traditions as a way of celebrating the city's Dutch heritage. In 1773, a New York newspaper mentioned that descendants of Dutch families were celebrating St. Nicholas's feast day. The writer called him Santa Claus, an anglicized version of Sinterklaas. It's one of the first times the name appears in print in English. But the real transformation, the moment when St. Nicholas began his evolution into the Santa Claus we recognize today, came in the early 1800s. And it came through literature. In 1809, a writer named Washington Irving published a satirical book called A History of New York from the Beginning of the World to the End of the Dutch Dynasty. Irving, who would later become famous for stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, wasn't Dutch himself, but he was fascinated by New York's Dutch past. His book purported to be a history, but it was really a comedy, full of absurd exaggerations and invented details. And throughout the book, St. Nicholas appeared as a recurring character, the patron saint of New Amsterdam. Irving's St. Nicholas was jolly, generous, and magical. He smoked a pipe. He rode over rooftops in a flying wagon. He brought gifts to good children.
He was plump and cheerful, more like a friendly grandfather than a stern bishop. Infanty made up many of these details. They weren't part of the traditional Dutch Sinterklaas, but they stuck. Irving's book was wildly popular, and his version of St. Nicholas began to take root in the American imagination.
Around the same time, a man named John Pintard, who was trying to promote St. Nicholas as the patron saint of New York, published pamphlets about the saint that included Dutch poems and images of a kindly gift-giver. Pintard was trying to create traditions for a young nation, to give New Yorkers something to celebrate that was distinctly their own. And St. Nicholas, with his connection to the city's Dutch past, seemed like the perfect figure. Then, in 1823, everything changed. On December 23rd, a newspaper in Troy, New York, called the Troy Sentinel, published a poem. It was titled Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, but it's now known by its opening line, "'Twas the night before Christmas." The poem was published anonymously. No one knew who had written it. But years later, a man named Clement Clark Moore, a scholar and poet, claimed authorship. Moore said he had written the poem for his children on Christmas Eve in 1822, and a friend had sent it to the newspaper without his knowledge. Some scholars have questioned whether Moore really wrote it. They've suggested that another poet, Henry Livingston, Jr., might have been the true author. The debate continues. But whoever wrote it, the poem had an enormous impact. It created, almost single-handedly, the modern image of Santa Claus. Let's think about what the poem does. It describes St. Nicholas as a jolly old elf, small and plump, with a round belly that shakes when he laughs like a bowl full of jelly. He has twinkling eyes, rosy cheeks, and a white beard. He wears fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes are tarnished with ashes and soot. He smokes a pipe. He flies through the air in a sleigh pulled by 8 tiny reindeer. And he even names them: Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donder, and Blitzen. He enters houses through the chimney. He fills the stockings hanging by the fire. He says nothing, just nods, and then disappears back up the chimney to continue his rounds. And all of this happens on Christmas Eve, not December 6th. The poem moved St. Nicholas away from his traditional feast day and attached him firmly to Christmas, the most important Christian holiday, the celebration of Christ's birth. This was new. St. Nicholas had never been particularly associated with Christmas before. He had his own day, December 6th. But the poem placed him on Christmas Eve, and that's where he stayed. Within a few years, the poem was being reprinted in newspapers and magazines across America. People memorized it. They read it to their children. Artists began illustrating it, and with each illustration, with each reading, the image solidified. This was Santa Claus, this cheerful, magical, gift-bringing figure who came on Christmas Eve. But there was still work to be done. The poem described Santa, but it didn't show him. Illustrators had to imagine what he looked like based on the words. And one illustrator, more than any other,
shaped the visual image of Santa Claus that we carry in our minds today. His name was Thomas Nast. Nast was a German immigrant who became one of the most influential political cartoonists in American history. He worked for Harper's Weekly, one of the most widely read magazines in the country. And from 1863 onwards, he drew Santa Claus almost every Christmas. His first Santa appeared during the Civil War, on the cover of Harper's Weekly in January 1863. The image was titled Santa Claus in Camp, and it showed Santa visiting Union soldiers, bringing them gifts and cheer. Santa was dressed in stars and stripes, a patriotic figure supporting the Northern cause. But as the years went on, Nast refined his Santa. He made him larger, more grandfatherly. He gave him a workshop full of toys. He placed that workshop at the North Pole, far from the concerns of the world, a magical place where Santa and his helpers could work year-round. He drew Santa keeping lists of children, checking them twice, recording who had been naughty and who had been nice. He showed Santa reading letters from children, letters that poured in from all over the world. He gave Santa elves, small, cheerful workers who helped build the toys. Every detail we associate with Santa's mythology, Nast contributed or popularized. The North Pole, the workshop, the elves, the lists, even the red suit, though in Nast's early drawings, Santa's clothes varied in color. Nast's illustrations appeared in Harper's Weekly year after year, and because Harper's was distributed nationally, his version of Santa became America's version. Other illustrators copied his work or built on it. By the late 1800s, Santa Claus was a fully formed figure in American culture. He was no longer St. Nicholas, the medieval bishop. He was something new, a secular symbol of Christmas, of generosity, of childhood wonder. He belonged to everyone, not just to Christians, not just to any one religion or denomination. He was part of the cultural fabric woven into the holiday season. Department stores began hiring men to dress as Santa, to sit on thrones and listen to children's wishes. This practice started in the late 1800s and quickly became a tradition. Going to see Santa at the department store, sitting on his lap, telling him what you wanted for Christmas became a ritual for American families. And Santa, of course, was always happy to listen. He was patient, kind, and most importantly, he was there to encourage children to think about the gifts they wanted, which meant encouraging parents to buy those gifts at that particular store. Santa had become commercial. And while some lamented this, arguing that the true meaning of Christmas was being lost, others saw it as harmless. Santa was fun. He made children happy. He brought families together. And if he also helped sell toys and merchandise, well, that was just the way of the world. Santa had become commercial. And while some lamented this, arguing that the true meaning of Christmas was being lost, others saw it as harmless. Santa was fun. He made children happy. He brought families together. And if he also helped sell toys and merchandise, well, that was just the way of the world.
Then, in 1931, something happened that would cement Santa's image in the global consciousness. The Coca-Cola Company hired an artist named Haddon Sundblom to create paintings of Santa Claus for their holiday advertising campaign.
Sundblom, who was born in Michigan to Swedish immigrant parents, was already a successful commercial artist. He understood how to create images that were warm, appealing, and relatable. For Coca-Cola, he painted Santa as a large, jovial man with rosy cheeks, twinkling eyes, and a huge white beard. Santa wore a red suit trimmed with white fur, a thick black belt, and black boots. He carried a sack of toys, he drank Coca-Cola, and he looked absolutely delighted to be doing so. Sundblom's Santa was based on the descriptions in Moore's poem and the visual traditions established by Nast and other illustrators. He wasn't inventing Santa from scratch. But his paintings were so beautifully done, so widely distributed, and so consistently used in Coca-Cola's advertising for over 3 decades that they became definitive. When people around the world thought of Santa Claus, they thought of Sundblom's Santa. And because Coca-Cola advertised globally, that image spread everywhere. Santa's red suit, which had appeared in earlier illustrations, became standardized. It was always red and white, Coca-Cola's colors, though the company didn't invent the red suit. They simply popularized it to the point where it became inseparable from Santa's identity. There's a persistent myth that Coca-Cola invented Santa Claus, or that they chose his colors to match their brand. This isn't true. Santa existed long before Coca-Cola's advertising campaigns, and he was wearing red in many illustrations long before 1931. But Coca-Cola did help create the modern, standardized image of Santa that is now recognized in virtually every country on Earth. Their advertising was that effective. By the mid-20th century, Santa Claus had traveled far from his origins as a 4th-century bishop in Asia Minor. He had become a global figure, adapted and adopted by cultures around the world, each putting their own spin on the legend. In the United States, he lived at the North Pole and rode in a sleigh pulled by reindeer. In the Netherlands, Sinterklaas still lived in Spain and rode a white horse. In Britain, Father Christmas, who had originally been a separate figure associated with the Old English celebration of Christmas, had merged with Santa Claus into something that combined elements of both. In Germany, the Christkind, a gift-bringing angel, competed with the Weihnachtsmann, the Christmas man, who was essentially the German version of Santa. In France, Père Noël brought gifts on Christmas Eve. In Italy, Befana, a kind old witch, delivered presents on Epiphany. In Russia, Ded Moroz, Grandfather Frost, came on New Year's Eve accompanied by his granddaughter Sneguruchka. Different cultures, different names, different traditions, but the core idea remained the same. A magical figure who rewards children with gifts during the winter holiday season. And increasingly, as American media and American culture spread around the world, these local figures began to look more and more like the American Santa Claus. Red suit, white beard, jolly laugh, sleigh, and reindeer. The standardized version. But let's pause for a moment and think about how strange this evolution is. We started with a real person, a bishop who lived 1700 years ago, who gave away his wealth to help the poor, who was imprisoned for his faith, who devoted his life to serving others. That man has been transformed through centuries of storytelling and cultural adaptation into a magical being who lives at the North Pole, flies through the air, and delivers presents to every child on Earth in a single night. How did we get from point A to point B? The answer is layered, complex, and deeply human. We got there because people need stories. We need figures who embody the values we hold dear: generosity, kindness, selflessness, magic. Nicholas of Myra, in his own time, embodied some of those values. He was generous. He helped those in need. And after his death, as stories about him spread, he became a symbol of those virtues. But symbols are malleable. They change shape depending on who's telling the story and why. When Christianity spread to Northern Europe, it encountered cultures that already had their own winter gift givers, their own magical figures associated with the darkest time of the year. The Church, pragmatic as always, didn't try to erase these figures. It absorbed them. It gave them a Christian name, a Christian backstory. Saint Nicholas became the acceptable, Christianized version of older pagan traditions. He brought gifts, but he did so in the name of Christ. He rewarded good children, but goodness was defined by Christian virtues. He was both familiar and new, pagan and Christian, comforting and commanding. When those traditions crossed the Atlantic to the New World, they encountered a different context. America was religiously diverse. It was commercially minded. It was young and eager to create its own traditions, its own identity. And so St. Nicholas was transformed again. He became less religious, more secular. He became an American invention, a figure who belonged to everyone, regardless of their faith or lack thereof. He became Santa Claus. And then, through the 20th century, through movies and television and advertising and global media, that American version of Santa Claus spread around the world. He became, in some ways, more recognizable than any other figure, except perhaps Mickey Mouse. Children from Tokyo to Toronto, from Sydney to Stockholm, knew who Santa was. They knew he wore red. They knew he said, "Ho, ho, ho." They knew he brought presents. The details varied, but the basic story was the same. And so we arrive at the present, where Santa Claus is everywhere and nowhere. He's in every mall, on every Christmas card, in every holiday movie. But he's also somehow ephemeral, a story we agree to tell together, a collective fiction that brings joy precisely because we know it isn't real, but we choose to believe anyway. Children write letters to Santa. Parents orchestrate elaborate charades to maintain the illusion. Cookies are left out on Christmas Eve, carrots for the reindeer. And in the morning, they're gone, eaten, proof that Santa was there. We know it's parents. The parents know we know. But we all participate because the story is more important than the truth. The story gives us something to believe in, even if just for a little while. And when children grow up and learn that Santa isn't real, they join the conspiracy. They become part of the magic for the next generation. They preserve the story because they remember how it felt to believe. But here's something interesting to consider. While Santa Claus has become increasingly secularized, increasingly commercial, increasingly disconnected from his origins as a Christian saint, there's still something deeply resonant about the core of the story. A figure who gives without anything in return, who rewards kindness, who sees you when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake, not to punish you, but to recognize your efforts to be good. In a strange way, Santa Claus has become a moral teacher, a non-religious but deeply ethical figure who encourages generosity, thoughtfulness, and good behavior. And perhaps that's not so far from what Nicholas of Myra was trying to do in the 4th century. He gave to those in need. He modeled generosity. He lived according to his principles. The man and the myth are separated by 1,700 years and enormous cultural transformations. But maybe, in some small way, they're still connected. Maybe the reason Santa Claus has endured, has spread, has become so beloved, is that he embodies something we genuinely need: the belief that goodness exists, that generosity is possible, that someone out there is paying attention to how we treat each other. It's a comforting thought in a complicated world. Now let's talk about some of the specific elements of the Santa mythology and where they came from. The reindeer, for instance. Moore's poem gave Santa 8 reindeer and named them all: Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donder, and Blitzen. The last 2 names in the original poem were actually Dunder and Bliksem, which are closer to the Dutch words for thunder and lightning. Later editions changed them to the German-sounding Donder and Blitzen. But where did the idea of reindeer come from in the first place? It's possible Moore borrowed the idea from earlier sources. There was a children's book published in 1821 called The Children's Friend that featured a poem about Santa Claus riding in a sleigh pulled by a single reindeer. Moore might have seen this and expanded on it. Reindeer also made sense for a figure associated with winter and the north. They're Arctic animals, strong and fast, capable of surviving in harsh conditions. If you're going to have a magical gift bringer who operates in winter, having him pulled by reindeer is logical in a fairy tale sort of way. And of course, much later, in 1939, a copywriter at the Montgomery Ward department store created Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer, as part of a promotional campaign. Rudolph became so popular that he was added to the Santa mythology permanently, joining the original 8 and leading the way with his glowing nose. Rudolph's story was its own cultural phenomenon, adapted into a song, a television special, and countless other forms. He became, in some ways, as famous as Santa himself. The North Pole was Thomas Nast's contribution. Before Nast, there was no consistent location for Santa's home. Moore's poem didn't specify where he came from, only that he arrived on Christmas Eve and left the same night. But Nast, in his illustrations for Harper's Weekly, placed Santa firmly at the North Pole. Why the North Pole? Perhaps because it was remote, inaccessible, mysterious. It was a blank space on the map, a place where magical things could happen without being observed or disproved. It was also fitting for a winter figure. The North Pole is the ultimate winter location. Frozen year-round, dark for half the year, empty of human habitation. It was perfect. And so the North Pole became Santa's home, and the idea stuck. Later storytellers added details. Santa's workshop, where toys were made year-round. The elves who worked there, cheerful and industrious, happy to serve. The massive lists of children. The surveillance operation that somehow kept track of every child on Earth. The letters that poured in from around the world. The reindeer stables. Mrs. Claus, who first appeared in American literature in the mid-1800s as Santa's wife, a kind and capable woman who helped manage the operation at the North Pole. All of these elements were added gradually by different writers and artists, each building on what came before. There was no single creator, no master plan. The mythology grew organically, the way myths always do, through collective storytelling. The elves are particularly interesting. They weren't part of the original St. Nicholas legend at all. They seem to have entered the Santa mythology through two routes. First, Moore's poem described Santa himself as a right jolly old elf, which suggested a connection to fairy tale and folklore. But Moore was talking about Santa, not about helpers. The idea of elves as Santa's workers came later, and it seems to have been influenced by Scandinavian folklore, where elves and other small magical beings were common. These creatures were often depicted as craftsmen, skilled at making things. When combined with the idea of Santa's workshop, it made sense that he would have helpers, and that those helpers would be elves. By the early 20th century, Santa's elves were a standard part of the story. They made the toys, they checked the lists, they loaded the sleigh. They were loyal, hard-working, and perpetually cheerful, the ideal employees. The fact that they were never paid, never took vacations, and existed solely to serve Santa's mission is something we generally don't examine too closely. It's magic. It's make-believe. The normal rules don't apply. But if you think about it for even a moment, the whole setup starts to seem a bit dystopian. An omniscient figure who monitors the behavior of every child on Earth, who maintains a massive surveillance system, who employs a workforce of magical beings who apparently have no agency or life outside their labor. It's unsettling if you look at it from the wrong angle. But of course, we don't look at it from that angle. We look at it as children do, with wonder and excitement and the willing suspension of disbelief. Santa is good. The elves are happy. Everything is fine. The chimney is one of the oldest parts of the Santa story, traceable all the way back to the original legend of Nicholas and the three daughters. The bag of gold that went down the chimney and landed in a stocking. That detail was already there in the 4th century, or at least in the stories about the 4th century that were written down much later. But it got reinforced and amplified by Moore's poem. Santa comes down the chimney. He's covered in soot. He fills the stockings. The chimney became his signature entrance, the way he could enter every house in the world without using the door. It's magical, but it's also practical in a storybook sense. Doors are locked, windows might be shut, but the chimney is open. It connects the inside of the house to the outside. It's a threshold, a liminal space, and those spaces are always important in folklore. The chimney lets Santa move between the ordinary world and the magical one. And the soot, the ashes, mark him as someone who has traveled through fire, through transformation. He emerges from the hearth, the heart of the home, bringing warmth and gifts. There's something almost primal about it, even if we don't consciously recognize it. Fire, warmth, survival, generosity, all bound together in the image of a figure coming down the chimney on the darkest night of the year.
The naughty and nice list is another modern addition, popularized by songs and stories in the 20th century. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. So be good for goodness sake. It's from the song Santa Claus is Coming to Town, written in 1934. The song codified the idea that Santa is always watching, always judging, keeping a running tally of your behavior. It's a little creepy when you think about it, but it's also effective. It gives parents a tool. Behave, or Santa won't bring you presents. The threat is mild. The consequences are limited. But for a child, the idea of Christmas morning arriving with no gifts is devastating. And so the naughty and nice list became a behavioral management system, a way to encourage good conduct in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Some families use it lightly, a gentle reminder. Others lean into it more heavily, with Elf on the Shelf and other modern additions that reinforce the idea that Santa is watching. The surveillance has become more elaborate, more intrusive, but also more playful. It's a game, but a game with stakes. And children, for the most part, play along. Let's talk about the letters to Santa. This tradition emerged in the late 19th century and became widespread in the 20th. Children write letters to Santa, telling him what they want for Christmas, assuring him that they've been good, sometimes including drawings or other personal touches. The letters are addressed to the North Pole, or to Santa Claus, or sometimes just to Santa. In many countries, postal services set up systems to handle these letters. In the United States, the post office has a program where volunteers respond to letters addressed to Santa. In Canada, Santa has his own postal code, HOH0OH. Yes, really. Hundreds of thousands of letters arrive every year, and volunteers write back, making sure every child who writes to Santa gets a response. It's a lovely tradition, a way of keeping the magic alive, of participating in the collective story. The letters themselves are fascinating documents. Some are simple wish lists. Others are heartbreaking. Children asking Santa to help their sick parents, to bring their soldier fathers home from war, to fix their broken families, to make the hurting stop. Santa has become, for many children, a figure you can talk to when you can't talk to anyone else. A benevolent listener who might, just might, be able to help. Of course, Santa can't fix those things, but the act of writing the letter, of putting your hope down on paper, has its own value. It's a ritual, a way of expressing what you need, even if no one can truly give it to you.
And then there's the question of what happens when children stop believing in Santa. It's a rite of passage, a moment of disillusionment that every child eventually faces. Maybe they figure it out on their own, noticing inconsistencies, spotting the same wrapping paper in their parents' closet that appeared under the tree. Maybe a classmate tells them. Maybe they confront their parents directly. However it happens, the realization comes. Santa isn't real. For some children, this is devastating. For others, it's a relief, a confirmation of suspicions they'd been harboring. But almost always, there's a moment of loss. The world becomes a little smaller, a little more ordinary. The magic fades. And then something interesting happens. Children who learn the truth often become protective of it. They don't want to ruin the experience for younger siblings or friends. They join the conspiracy of adults, preserving the illusion for those who still believe. They start to understand that the magic of Santa isn't about whether he's real in a literal sense. It's about the feeling, the wonder, the shared story. And in some ways, keeping the secret, participating in the magic for others, is its own kind of belief. You're no longer the child waiting for Santa. You are Santa, or at least part of the mechanism that makes Santa happen. You're giving rather than receiving, and there's something profound in that transition. As an adult, Santa becomes something different. For some, he's a nostalgic figure, a reminder of childhood wonder. For others, he's a commercial annoyance, a symbol of everything that's wrong with modern Christmas. The crass consumerism, the endless advertising, the pressure to buy and spend and perform the perfect holiday. For parents, Santa is a tool, a tradition, a responsibility. You have to be Santa now. You have to keep the magic alive for your own children. You have to do the late-night shopping, the wrapping, the careful hiding of presents. You have to eat the cookies and drink the milk. You have to write "From Santa" on the tags. You have to monitor the naughty and nice situation, deploying the threat when necessary, forgiving transgressions as Christmas approaches. It's exhausting. It's expensive. But most parents do it anyway, because they remember what it felt like to believe, and they want to give that to their children. And when it works, when your child's face lights up on Christmas morning, when they believe, truly believe, that Santa came, that he was real, that the magic happened, it feels worth it. You've given them a story they'll carry with them for the rest of their lives.
But not everyone celebrates Santa Claus. Some families, for religious reasons, choose not to participate in the Santa tradition. They feel it detracts from the religious meaning of Christmas, which is the celebration of Christ's birth. They don't want their children to associate Christmas primarily with getting presents from a magical figure, rather than understanding the theological significance of the holiday. This is a reasonable position. Saint Nicholas, after all, was a real saint, a real bishop, a man of deep faith. The modern Santa Claus, by contrast, is thoroughly secularized. He has almost no religious content anymore. He's been commercialized, commodified, turned into a marketing tool. For some families, that's a bridge too far.
They teach their children about the real St. Nicholas, about his generosity and his faith. But they skip the North Pole and the reindeer and the flying sleigh. Other families find a middle ground, celebrating both the religious and the secular aspects, treating them as separate but coexisting traditions. Christmas is about the birth of Jesus, but it's also about Santa Claus and presents and fun. Both can be true at the same time. And for many families, that's how it works. They go to church on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, and then they come home and open presents from Santa. The sacred and the secular exist side by side, sometimes uneasily, but mostly in a kind of truce. And, of course, there are families who don't celebrate Christmas at all, for whom Santa Claus is simply a figure from someone else's culture, someone else's story. But even in those families, in cultures that don't celebrate Christmas, Santa Claus is often recognized. He's become such a global icon that his image transcends religious and cultural boundaries. He appears in advertisements, in movies, in stores, even in countries where Christianity is a minority religion, or where Christmas isn't widely celebrated. He's become, in some strange way, a universal figure. Not universal in the sense that everyone believes in him or celebrates him, but universal in the sense that everyone knows who he is. You can show a picture of Santa Claus to someone almost anywhere in the world, and they'll recognize him. They might not celebrate Christmas, they might not care about Santa, but they'll know who he is. That's a remarkable level of cultural penetration for a figure who didn't even exist in his current form 200 years ago. Let's consider, too, the way Santa Claus has been adapted and reimagined in popular culture. There are countless movies, television specials, books, and songs about Santa. Some portray him traditionally as the jolly gift bringer we all know. Others subvert the image, imagining a darker Santa, a tired Santa, a Santa who's forgotten why he does what he does. There are stories where Santa is real and has to save Christmas from some threat. There are stories where Santa is a metaphor for something else entirely. There are horror movies where Santa is the villain. There are comedies where Santa is incompetent. There are dramas where Santa is a symbol of hope in a cynical world. The figure is malleable enough to support all of these interpretations. He can be whatever the storyteller needs him to be. And each new story, each new adaptation adds another layer to the mythology. Some of these stories fade quickly, forgotten within a year or two. Others become classics, part of the permanent Santa canon. A Christmas Carol, though not about Santa, established many of the themes we associate with Christmas stories: redemption, generosity, the importance of human connection. Miracle on 34th Street from 1947 asked whether Santa was real and answered with a resounding maybe, preserving the magic through ambiguity. How the Grinch Stole Christmas, though focused on a different character, reinforced the idea that Christmas, and by extension Santa, represents something more than material goods. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer gave us a misfit who found his place. The Polar Express explored belief and wonder in a world that's increasingly skeptical of both. Each of these stories contributes to the ongoing conversation about who Santa is and what he means. In recent years, there's been increasing attention paid to some of the more problematic aspects of Santa traditions. The mall Santas, who are predominantly white, raising questions about representation and inclusivity. The idea of Santa as an authority figure who monitors and judges children's behavior, which can feel invasive or controlling. The commercialism that surrounds Santa, the way he's used to sell products, to encourage consumption, to equate love with spending. These are legitimate critiques. And some families are rethinking how they approach Santa, trying to find ways to preserve the positive aspects, the generosity and wonder and magic, while letting go of the parts that don't serve them or that make them uncomfortable. There's no one right way to do Santa. Every family has to figure out what works for them. Some go all in with elaborate traditions and carefully staged Christmas morning scenes. Others keep it simple, acknowledging Santa, but not making him the center of the holiday. Still others skip him entirely, focusing on other aspects of the season. And all of these approaches are valid. Santa Claus is a story, and like all stories, it can be told in many different ways.
What's remarkable is how long this story has lasted and how far it's traveled. From a 4th century bishop in Turkey to a global icon recognized by billions of people. From stories of secret generosity to a massive cultural industry. From religious saint to secular symbol. The journey is strange and winding and full of unexpected turns. Nicholas of Myra could never have imagined what his legacy would become. He was trying to live according to his faith, to help those in need, to be a good bishop in a dangerous time. He had no way of knowing that 17 centuries later, children all over the world would write letters to a magical version of him, asking for toys and games, and sometimes just for their families to be okay. He had no way of knowing that his image would be used to sell soda, and that artists would spend decades refining his appearance until it was standardized and copyrighted and instantly recognizable. He had no way of knowing that his story would be blended with pagan myths and Dutch traditions and American literature and commercial advertising, until the original man was almost invisible beneath the layers of legend. But maybe, if he could see it all, if he could understand what had happened to his story, he wouldn't be entirely unhappy. Because at the core of it all, beneath the commercialism and the consumerism and the flying reindeer and all the rest, there's still that original impulse. Generosity. Giving to others, especially to those who need it most, expecting nothing in return. That was what Nicholas did. That's what Santa represents, at least in theory. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it's okay that the story changed, that it adapted, that it became something Nicholas never intended, as long as that core idea, that seed of generosity, is still there. So where did Santa Claus come from? He came from a real person who lived a long time ago. He came from stories that were told and retold until they took on lives of their own. He came from cultural traditions that blended and merged and transformed across centuries. He came from literature and art and advertising and collective imagination. He came from our need for magic, for wonder, for something to believe in
during the darkest part of the year. He came from nowhere and everywhere, a creation that feels both ancient and modern, both deeply rooted and entirely made up. He is, in the end, what we need him to be, a gift giver, a symbol, a story we agree to tell together. And every year, as December approaches, we tell it again. We bring out the decorations, we play the songs, we write the letters, we leave out the cookies, we gather on Christmas morning and open the presents and preserve the magic for another generation. Because that's what stories do. They survive, they adapt, they endure. And Santa Claus, whatever else he is one of the greatest stories we've ever told. If tonight's journey through history helped calm your mind, if these slow wanderings through the past eased you toward sleep, consider liking and subscribing. And if you're still awake, still following these threads through the darkness, drop a comment below. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is. Tell me if you believed in Santa once and what it felt like when you stopped, or if you never stopped at all. Because in the end, belief is a choice we make, a gift we give ourselves. And maybe that's what Nicholas of Myra understood all those centuries ago when he tossed bags of gold through windows in the dead of night. The gift isn't just the object, it's the gesture, it's the thought, it's the moment when someone realizes that they're not alone, that someone cared enough to help, to give, to make things a little bit better. That's the real magic. And it doesn't require reindeer or chimneys or a workshop at the North Pole. It just requires someone who's willing to be generous, to give without expecting anything back. That person, whoever they are, wherever they are, is Santa Claus. And maybe we all have the chance to be Santa sometimes, in small ways, in quiet ways, when no one's looking. Maybe that's the real story, the one that matters most. Not the myth, but the truth it points toward. The truth that generosity exists, that kindness is possible, that even in the darkest times, people will help each other. And that's worth believing in. So rest now. Let the story settle. Let the weight of all these words, all these centuries, all this history carry you gently toward sleep. Good night.